Welcome to the 14th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee. Can I remind everyone to please turn off mobile phones or other electronic devices. Our first agenda item is a report back on the fact-finding visit that we had to the Atos Assessment Centre in Edinburgh 2 weeks ago, I think now. The committee agreed that Kevin Stewart should report back on behalf of the group who attended. That was Kevin, Alex, Johnson and myself. So let Kevin take you through his impressions of the visit. I'll give Alex an opportunity to add any comments, and then we'll have a discussion until we exhaust any questions and issues that might come up in Kevin's contribution. So I'll just pass over to you, Kevin. You can take us through your views on the meeting.
Thank you, Convener. And first of all, I'd like to thank the clerks for the note provided of the meeting, which I think was very interesting. And obviously, Convener, I'm sure that yourself and Alec Johnson will have a few bits and pieces to add. I think, first of all, I should say, Convener, that sometimes it's very difficult to gauge what is going on when you have a role-playing situation. But I pay due respect to the actress who played the part of the person coming for interview. She was very good, even though the room was crowded with Atos people and officials, which didn't give us a great impression of what would be going on either. But I think there are a number of things, Convener, which I think were quite surprising to us. And I think would be even more surprising to members of the public. And I think the key thing in all of this is the division of responsibility between Atos and the Department of Works and Pensions, because the general public, because of the media and other sources, seem to think that the Atos folk who are carrying out the assessment are actually the decision makers as well. And the decision makers are officials from the Department of Works and Pensions and not the officials from Atos who carry out the assessment. And I think that is probably one of the great weaknesses in the system, and the fact that the person who is making the assessment is not actually the decision maker. And I'll expand on that because we got the opportunity to see exactly what the assessor had written down. We've seen the boxes that had been ticked, and we saw the comments that had been made. And quite frankly, from my own perspective, and I don't know if the others would agree, but as we were going through the tick box exercise, if you like, it looked very much like that person was fit for work. When, quite frankly, if you'd seen what had gone on there, you would have said that person was completely unfit for work. But what may have swung it for the decision maker, and we don't know what the decision maker would have done in this case, was the assessor's ability to write a few bits and pieces. And when I say a few bits and pieces, I mean a few, because there was not a huge amount of room for manoeuvre in terms of the writing. You know, it is the interpretation of the writing of the assessor that could make the difference for the person who is actually being assessed at that moment in time. The software system that is used is called the Lima system. As I say, most of it is actually a tick box. This, of course, has been looked at by Professor Harrington in his various reviews. Personally, I don't think that system is quite right. And a lot of decisions will be made on the writing that has taken place by the assessor. And, you know, various bits and pieces of writing can often be interpreted in different ways. And I was being asked to describe this by somebody, and I suggested that it's like buying something from the internet in a description only. where you're often majorly disappointed in the thing that you actually get. And I think that, you know, in terms of description, it is open for interpretation, and I do have a difficulty with some faceless bureaucrat basing everything on the writings of somebody else who has assessed the person that has been in front of them. I think that we have found during the course of the visit that sometimes there's not full cooperation with ATOS from other healthcare professionals. We were told that GPs fail to respond in about half of the cases that are being assessed, and I think that there's a great danger in that as well, because their input could lead to some different outcomes in terms of the assessment that is made. It is very difficult, I think, convener, to explain all of the ins and outs unless you've seen the process for yourself. I think the process in terms of the interaction between the assessor and the actress in this case was extremely good, but then you wonder if every single assessor handles everything in the same way. We did get the opportunity to meet a couple of other assessors, and they seemed to be absolutely fine too. But the reality is we have only got a little snapshot of what is going on. We really, I think, require a number of other things to be clarified round about the throughput of claimants. I think we need to see the changes that have taken place in the assessment after the various Harrington reviews. We need to get an understanding of how many assessments are undertaken by each of the healthcare professionals, whether that be doctors or nurses or others. I think the committee really needs to see a copy of the initial DWP form, a copy of the assessment ESA 50 form, and one of the issues that was raised was around about the levels of violence increasing in ATOS centres, because obviously, as I said at the very beginning, these folks are getting the blame for making decisions when they're not the folk who are making the decisions, and I think we need that figures for violence against staff. But I think the key thing, convener, is it is all fair and well us going to ATOS and seeing the assessment folks in action. But I think that we really need to talk to some of the decision makers and see how they interpret the information that comes from that assessment. And at the end of the day, I think that we need to ensure that the general public are aware that the ATOS assessors are not the decision makers, and that lies entirely with the Department of Work and Pensions. I'm quite sure, convener, that yourself and Alec will have things to add to that.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I think that was a very fair assessment of what we saw. But Alec, you want to add any comments?
There's not a lot different, I would say. Perhaps in that I got the very clear impression that ATOS have been portrayed as the villain of the piece, and are probably not. The process that they're going through is one that, in individual cases, is open to the making of mistakes, I'm sure. But I think what we saw was a fairly robust process that they carry out in a fairly objective manner. But what we learned was that ATOS are just a link in the chain, and that there is a problem perhaps in how they link to the neighbouring links in the chain. At the front end, there is an issue about who actually is called in for an ATOS assessment. And the information we got was that the reason for being called in for an assessment is often to do with the fact that some applicants put very little information on their form, which makes it difficult for them to interpret. But as was mentioned by Kevin earlier, the biggest problem they have is that 50% of calls to GPs for information simply result in no response. And when there's no response from a GP, that often leaves no alternative but to call somebody in for interview simply because there is no other way of getting the information. So there's an obvious opportunity to tighten up there. But the difficulty seems to be at the other end of the ATOS process, and that is that the information that they're providing, though it may be objective and it may be accurate, is passed on, and we have no way of knowing how that information is used. So I think the key issue for me was that there needs to be robust quality control assessment going on in this system to make sure that decisions are not being made using this information that would not meet the approval of the person who did the assessment in the first place. There has to be some continuity, there has to be some check that allows us to be confident that ATOS's role in the process is being properly used as it moves on through the process.
Thanks so much, Alex. Yeah, I for my own part, would agree with what Kevin and Alex have identified. It's the structural weaknesses in the system, I think, which were the biggest concern I had when I left the meeting. Now, clearly, ATOS had put on their best bib and tucker for us to turn up. They had a very senior person carrying out the assessment. He had a very nice bedside manner, and he took us through the process in a very clear and concise way. But I think it was this, as Kevin says, the division of responsibility, which concerned me. The fact that so few GPs provide information at the outset means that when people are turning up to these assessments, the assessor has got very little knowledge, you know, to base questions and assessments on. And it could well be that we need to ask the health service here what they can do to improve the response levels from general practitioners, because, you know, it was made absolutely clear to us that, you know, someone being called in for an assessment, a lot of that depends on the information that's provided by the GP at the outset. And if the GP doesn't respond, then the only way... Yeah, it means that the ATOS then have to call the person in. They then are making an assessment on very little information. And I think one of the statistics that struck me was that of the people who are called in for assessment, it's 15%, I think, who appeal the outcome of that assessment, and it's 40% of that 15% which are overturned by the tribunal. And in that 40%, 90% of those who have their decision overturned at appeal, it's done on the basis that information which was not available at the outset becomes available to the tribunal. And that just shows me that there's a structural weakness in the system, that people are getting to the end of the process, and only then is the information on which the assessment is made becoming absolutely clear. So I think we have to ask questions about, you know, how do we get the assessors, or, you know, because we talk about ATOS, but you could talk about any generic health assessor, I suppose. Whoever was doing the job would have the same problem, that we need to get the GPs to inform the assessors so that the assessors have got the best information available before they take someone through the process. And I think that's one of the structural weaknesses in it. The other one then is that the information, whatever it's collected, is then passed to a civil servant who makes a decision on the basis of the limited amount of information that comes forward from the assessment. And again, I think that's just a structural weakness in the system, that there's no communication directly between the assessor and the decision maker. The assessors made it absolutely clear they've got no knowledge of the outcome of the assessment when the decision's made. And the third thing that concerned me was the level of violence that was being reported. You know, people turning up in anticipation of there being a problem, carrying that morning's newspaper with the latest headline against ATOS, and expecting ATOS to be sitting there ready to strike them off their benefits. And I just think there's a culture started to develop which is becoming quite concerning. So we have to get this type of issue raised. I think it might be appropriate for us to contact the Health Secretary, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, and ask if there's something that that could be done within the NHS to get GPs to engage with this process, because I think that would help. But I think also Atos need to do a lot of work on their PR in order to try and just clarify exactly where they sit in the system. I'll open up to colleagues who might want to ask questions. I saw Linda first.
Yeah, it's just that last bit you were saying there, Convener, about whether something could be done to make the system a bit better with these structural weaknesses. I'm aware, as you are, that Lanarkshire Health Board are now going to be doing some of the work for Atos. Would it be worthwhile perhaps making contact with Lanarkshire Health Board to see how they intend to approach the situation and to find out in the background whether they are in fact enabled to do anything differently, or will they be forced to follow the same procedures that Atos already do?
I can answer that partly
Right.
directly back, Linda. A couple of weeks ago, I know you weren't able to attend, but the Lanarkshire MSPs met with Lanarkshire Health Board, and they had a representative from Salus at that meeting in order to answer any questions we might have had on that. And what struck me was that the representative from Salus who was there was saying that they were going to do things differently, that they were going to have an input into the decision-making process and what have you. When we turned up 3 or 4 days later to meet Atos, Atos were giving us exactly what Salus had said. So therefore there was an impression out there that Atos were the decision makers.
Right.
And even Salus believed that Atos were the decision makers. And that Salus have been told that they will have an input, that they will be able to talk to the DWP and try and inform the decision-making process. But Atos told us exactly the same thing. But in reality, they don't. I think there was one of the criteria was changed because Atos were feeding information back. I think it was on cancer patients. So Atos told us that when they see issues arising, they will feed that back to the DWP. Well, that was exactly what Salus said that they were doing. But it still remains that it's the DWP who draw up the questions and the assessments. And both Atos and Salus will do their work on the criteria set by the Department of Work and Pensions. But when I met with the official from Salus, I suggested to him that he might receive an invitation from us to come here and we'll get a chance. But since they don't start doing their assessments until the middle of next year, I think we probably need to wait a bit to see exactly how that's starting to roll out. But I think we will at some point have to get Salus to come in front of us.
Yes, thank you, Convener. On that point, I mean, obviously, even though they're starting in the middle of next year, I mean, they'll have to be making the preparations now, so it would be interesting to hear what the preparations are. Also, in that vein, it might be useful to see if we could get the BMA back to discuss that very issue. In terms of something you said in your report back, Convener, on the issue of the involvement or otherwise of GPs and the relationship of that to success or otherwise of appeals, I just wondered, as a comment, I mean, how in any event, though, can the questions be so out of kilter, irrespective of whether or not there's input from the GP? I mean, how can they be so out of kilter with an individual's actual situation? I think is an important question to bear in mind. And obviously it is the DWP that sets the questions, but I wonder, I mean, is there any differentiation made as to whether in a particular case there is input at the start from the GP or not, as to which then sort of suite of questions you proceed with? So I think there's further investigations that we can helpfully make here.
Kevin wanted to comment on that.
I think, Convener, if you look at the tick boxes, and I mean, this is a personal opinion and it may well be that yourself and Alec will disagree, but, as far as I'm concerned, some of the tick box questions were pretty irrelevant. And if you look at, for example, the ones round about how the person has presented themselves that day, are they clean and tidy and all of the rest of it, what the assessor was saying to us afterwards is that he then has to dig below that to find out if this is the norm or not. Now, obviously, what we had was probably one of their top-notch assessors. There are probably other folk, and I'm guessing here, but on a bad day might just tick the box and leave it, and that would be it. Now, you wonder about the relevance of such questions anyway, and there are others you could pick as well. A lot of what we seen was the assessor himself trying to dig below the questions, the tick box questions. Now, as I say, he was probably one of the better ones. Do they all do that? I don't know. But it seems to me that a lot of the original tick box questions are pretty irrelevant anyway. And again, convener, we don't know how they compare now to what they were originally before the first and second Harrington reviews. And I know that there's an ongoing review, and, well, we don't know if there will be any massive change to that or whether there will be a move away from the tick box exercise into much more script, so that the decision maker has got a real clue about what's going on.
Thank you, Convener. Can I thank yourself, Kevin and Alec, for the feedback you've been able to give from your visits. It was very useful, very worthwhile, and it occurs to me the two most obvious things arising from it are the issue about the GPs. I would actually, and I hear what you're saying, I think it would be very worthwhile to have Salas before us after they're doing work, but I do wonder, I think Annabel might be right, I think it would be useful to have them before that period and hear what their preparation are. I was at the briefing meeting that you were at, and if you take on face value what we've been told by Salas, it sounds they were actually going to be quite innovative, so I think it would be as well to get it on the record, and maybe we can have them back after they're actually beginning the work. And also do wonder if we should be getting the BME in, maybe a panel representing that sector, and ask them about this issue that's been identified. But I do think this does come all back to the fact that, of course, Atos have got a contract with the DWP. The DWP set the terms of it, so you know, it comes back to, I think we're going to have to keep in contact with them and pursuing them to come before us. And I do know, I think the letter has gone to the Secretary of State once more, so hopefully he will be a bit more positive in his latest response to this.
I think we should definitely follow up the GP issue. That seems pretty important, and it is an area that Scottish Government are responsible for, if at arm's length, so worth pursuing, I think. But I wanted to ask Kevin, in his remarks, he said that if, in his view, if you looked at the output from the assessment that you'd watched, you would have, that would have led you, if you were a decision maker who hadn't watched the assessment but was just looking at the output, that would have led you to think that this was somebody who was fit for work. But if you had watched the assessment and seen the person or the character which was being played, then your view would have been that they weren't fit for work. And I just wondered what you were alluding to there. Was there a problem with the assessment, or were the wrong questions being asked, or because that seems pretty fundamental to whether the system is actually delivering the proper outcome or not.
Convener, if I can clarify what I said again, because I was alluding to the tick box situation, whereby if you watched the assessor ticking the boxes, you would have probably come to the conclusion that the person was fit for work. What would have changed your mind was the added writing that he put in the limited space, and then that would have made you think, oh, maybe not. But as we were, and it was kind of difficult because the three of us were around one screen because there were technological problems. But as you watched him ticking off the boxes, you know, you began to get the impression this makes it look like that this person is okay. However, to clarify, in terms of the doctor's written responses in the small spaces that were available, that began to sway it the other way. But if you were relying on the tick boxes only, I would have said that a decision maker would have likely said that person was fit for work.
Yeah, I think it was, the question was asked whether Atos had a target to meet. I specifically asked that question. The Atos made it absolutely clear that they have no target because they make no decision. They just assess the information. But there was no clarification from the DWP whether they had a target or not. So it's the decision maker who may well ultimately be sitting at the end of the day saying, well, I have to get a certain number of people back into work. And it was never clarified whether that was the case. So I think it comes back to the point that Jamie's making. You know, we're going to keep asking the ministers at the DWP to come in front of us because we have got questions we need to ask them. But the offer has been made for us to speak to officials from the DWP, and I don't think we should rule that out, but I think we need to get answers from the DWP, because this system involves the NHS in Scotland, and they're working with a lot of service providers in Scotland in terms of getting people back to work. And unless we can see where everything joins up, then we're always going to be guessing as to how this system is working. So I just think we have to keep pursuing the DWP to get them in front of this committee, because we need to know exactly how this system is working and how it can be better used to do the job that it's supposed to be doing. Annabelle?
Thanks, Amelia. Yes, just on that point, actually, I attended the cross-party group on veterans, I think it was last week, and there were officials, well, there was one official from the DWP, and therefore some of the questions that were asked, technical questions from various veterans organisations, he had answers to, but the minute it strayed a wee bit more into policy, I'll have to take that higher up. He wasn't trying to be obstructive, that was his position. And therefore, you can only get so far by speaking to the officials. You're quite right to say that in order to try to get to the bottom of some of the key elements here, we really need to have the Secretary of State, preferably, feeling which the Minister here at committee, on the record, showing respect to this committee, which I believe they should be doing.
Just generally on, in addition to what's been said there, to re-emphasise the issue of GPs in this process, it seems that the input of GPs is vital, whether it's on in relation to the initial application. Failure to input from the GP can result in people being assessed, or is often a reason for people being assessed. And as we've heard, the appeals process, which is often successful because there is GP input at that stage. And it's the lack of GP input that is currently, in my view, putting the system under unnecessary pressure at the sharp end.
Kevin, I'll let you wrap up then at the end. We do have a number of questions that we'll pursue, but I'll give Kevin the opportunity, because we've overrun by a wee bit. I thought it was useful that we get everyone the opportunity to make comments. But Kevin, do you want to pull it together for us?
Convener, I think it is very useful that we have overrun. I think that one of the things which we need to find out is in terms of how much notice GPs are actually getting about this. Mm-hmm. Because it's all fair and well for others to say half of GPs are not responding. But what kind of timescales are these people getting to respond? Because at the end of the day, we know that they're all very busy anyway, and if it's a case of you must respond within a week kind of thing, then it's bound to fall down. So I think it's important that we find out exactly what timescales there are there. In terms of some of the things that have been mentioned round about the DWP itself, and the fact that ministers continue to refuse to come to this committee, one of the most interesting things for me about that meeting itself was the folk that were in the room with us as that assessment was taking place. Because one of the ladies who was in the room said that she managed the contract, and I asked her the question, managed the contract in Scotland, or no, for the whole of the UK, she said. So obviously there are some concerns from the DWP that we're actually undertaking these visits before they're sending some of their top bods to keep an eye on us, if you like. Now, if they're willing to send folk to keep an eye on us, well, I don't think it is, because if they showed us any respect, Alec, then either Ian Duncan Smith or Lord Freud would have attended this committee by now. So in terms of keeping an eye on us, if they're willing to do that and send the top bod up to do that, then they should be sending these folks to this committee so that we can have the answers that we need round about the decision makers. And I think it's extremely important that we look at this whole process. We have seen a bit of that process in terms of the assessment. What we really need to get to grips with is how the decision is taken. And on what criteria are folk deemed to be fit or unfit for work. And until we get that information, I think that we're still shooting in the dark, basically, because we have an aspect which has been taken out of all context in terms of what the general public think because of the lack of information or the misinformation. Atos have taken a lot of flack here, and the reality is that those folks who should be facing the flack thus far have failed to show face at this committee.
Totally endorse your final comment there, Kevin. The invitations then, we'll invite Salas and the BMA at some point to come and talk to us, and we'll write in relation to the GP issue and see if we can get some clarification about the points that Kevin's making about timescales. Linda, just to finish off, yeah.
Can you write for that clarification? And this is anecdotal from me just now, but I know there's an issue about GPs charging patients. So can we put that in the
Yeah, I think
the
what we
letter
might
as
be able
well
to
as
do
a
is look back at
discussion?
the evidence that we took. There was representation from the BMA before.
Oh, right, before I joined the
Yeah,
committee.
and we
Right.
did go into that a wee bit about whether there was a cost implication and what have you. So we might revisit that in terms of looking at what the questions need to be in relation to the GPs.
Can we try and get some decision makers, convener?
Yeah, well, why not? Yeah.
Sorry, just clarify, who are we writing to in that regard?
Salas, the BMA, to the NHS, and we'll try and get clarification around the DWP decision makers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone, for that. Okay, we'll just suspend for a couple of minutes till we get the Minister in. Okay, I'll go to agenda item 2 then, which is consideration of the affirmative order in relation to the social fund. And we're joined for this item by the Minister for Housing and Welfare and her officials. Can I particularly welcome you, Margaret, back to the committee. You're the first former member of the committee to come back in a ministerial capacity, and you're more than welcome back before us. I have a bit of a preamble before I invite you to make a contribution. It was just to say that we have split consideration of the order into 2 agenda items this morning. The first is an evidence session during which we'll be able to hear from the Minister and her officials in terms of answering any questions that the committee might have. The second part is the formal consideration of the motion, during which standing orders provide that only the Minister and members of the committee may contribute to any debate. Members will recall that at our last meeting we asked the Scottish Government to provide clarification of the drafting of the order, specifically in relation to how confident we could be that the Parliament would know what it was being asked to agree to in Article 2 of the order. The Government's response to this question is set out in the paper, number 1, which we have in front of us this morning. So with that, I'd like to invite the Minister to make any opening comments that she may have about the order before we do take questions from the committee. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks for the invitation to have the opportunity to be here and present the draft order. The draft order is to consider the Scotland Act 1998 modification of Schedule 5, Number 2, Order 2013 SSI 2013 that will amend the Schedule 5 to the Scotland Act to provide a new exception to the Social Security Reservation. This order is required because the UK Government's Welfare Reform Act 2012 abolishes the discretionary social fund from April the 1st, 2013. And as social security issues are currently a reserved matter for UK Government, a Section 30 order is required to create an exception to the Social Security Reservation in the Scotland Act 1998. The order will enable Scottish local authorities from the 1st of April 2013 to provide assistance to people who could previously have claimed a community care grant or a crisis loan for living expenses from the Department of Work and Pensions. And we indicated some time ago in our response to the Calman Commission that we support the devolution of the Social Fund and we welcome the opportunity to take on these new responsibilities. We see it as an opportunity to help mitigate some of the adverse impacts of the UK Government's welfare reforms and protect some of Scotland's most vulnerable people. That's why we've decided to top up the funding for the Scottish Welfare Fund by £9.2 million for its first year, an indication of our commitment to provide vital support for some of our most vulnerable citizens facing difficult times ahead as a result of these UK welfare reforms. We also can announce, I think you've had the letter, that we've had an additional £1.8 million for set-up costs in the first year, which takes that to over £2 million for the set-up costs, which is to be welcomed. The increased funding that we're putting into the Scottish Welfare Fund will have the capacity to award an additional 5,600 community care grants and over 100,000 crisis grants. We're working with colleagues in COSLA and local authorities on the development and implementation of the Scottish Welfare Fund. Great progress is being made and we're well on the way to producing a national guidance, an application form and training and monitoring arrangements for the scheme. In our working partnership with COSLA and local authorities, we're seeing how innovative and creative they are in their plans to embed the new scheme within existing local authority services. So therefore, the Section 30 order is a vital step in the process of ensuring that we have the necessary powers in Scotland to implement the Scottish Welfare Fund. And I'm ready to take questions now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minister. I'll open up to the committee to ask questions of the Minister on this. Linda.
When I was interested in the National Guidance Minister, just when you thought that would be available.
Still, the guidance is well underway. I think we're in the second draft just now and it's still out for consultation. I think it won't be issued, am I right in saying, until March when the order's through and in March, but the guidance is well underway and there's still opportunity for consultation and feedback on it.
We have had a look at the guidance and I know it's still a work in progress and we've got a session later on where we look at the guidance, but if we look at the social fund which this replaces, then that also depended significantly on guidance and regulations, but applicants to the fund always had the opportunity to appeal to the social fund commissioners to get a commissioner's decision as to whether the legislation underpinning the social fund had been properly applied. So I suppose what we have here is the replacement for that. So although the guidance will provide the detail, the fundamental principle is enshrined very briefly in here. But there's no recourse to a social fund commissioner or anything like it. So I just wonder, for applicants, to ensure that local authorities are actually providing the assistance that this requires them to, what kind of recourse would you expect them to have?
Right. Well, there's two things. Certainly we would hope that the scheme is consistent throughout Scotland and will be monitored and evaluated. But in terms of second tier review, that is being looked at. We recognise there is a demand for that people are looking for that, a second tier review, and that's currently being looked at as how we can take that through. There is quite considerable cost factors in it. Maybe somebody would like to comment on that in terms of the current system as it operates just now. But we certainly are looking at that and recognise that there has to be some review of a decision that's made for anybody that applies.
Well, in a previous session, the Cabinet Secretary said that, and the guidance in draft reflects that as well, that the second tier reviews are being looked at. It just might be helpful if some of the thinking could be shared with the committee.
Certainly it is something that we are actively looking at, but maybe pass on, Anne, if you want to see where we're at with it.
Yeah, I mean, we're working as fast as we can on looking at the options. It's quite complicated, and as the Minister said, we're trying to get something that's fit for purpose and that's something that's affordable. We're also trying to use to take account of other kind of areas where similar types of administrative decisions are made by local councils, and look at how the second tier review process might fit within that. So it is actively under consideration at the moment, and we're discussing it within colleagues internally that deal with social work services within local authorities, and we're having discussions with the Ombudsman later this week. So we will share some of that thinking as soon as we can.
Well, if you're looking at options currently, you must know what those options are, so I wonder if you could share that with us.
They're not particularly detailed options at the moment. There were 3 kind of suggestions that we looked at initially in relation to peer review by other councils, whether there was some form of independent chamber isn't the right word, but looking at another kind of board or kind of committee within a local authority that's separate from the original decision making. These are the types of things that we've been looking at.
Follows on slightly from that. I don't have a microphone. Oh, there we go. It follows on from that. The decision to devolve the social fund, when it was taken in Westminster, passed it down to local authorities in England and to the national governments or assemblies in England, in Scotland and Wales. Now, what is your position as to how you will include local authorities, or the proportionality of the inclusion of local authorities? Do you feel that it's best to administer it centrally from Edinburgh, or should it be the local authorities who take a substantial part of the decisions here?
In terms of the decisions on the...
I'm simply trying to compare the English model to the Scottish model to see how much you feel that you can involve local authorities in Scotland, given that local authorities had the full power devolved to them in England.
Yeah. Local authorities, it's in Scotland, it's the national scheme in terms of we want it to be uniform and consistent across Scotland, but it's going to be delivered by local authorities.
Yes.
So they will have the decision-making powers. There'll be national guidance, which we would hope they would follow, and the local authorities themselves and the decision makers there will make the decisions in their area. They will manage the budget in their area. They will manage the amount of community care grants, the amount of social, what are they called now? Crisis loans, crisis grants. They will manage that in their area. So they will have considerable amount of autonomy in doing that, although we would anticipate that the guidance and the scheme that somebody putting an application in one area of Scotland would be treated the same as putting an application in another area of Scotland.
The other thing I was going to ask briefly was for a total figure for the scheme. You said that the Scottish Government would be topping the scheme up by the £9.2 million, I believe, in year 1. What does that make the total budget for the scheme in year 1?
I think is it 32 million.
Yeah, it would be around about 33 million. We've only had indicative allocations from DWP as yet, and the latest indicative allocation was 23.8 million plus the 9.2, which gives a total of around about 33.
Yep.
Convener, going back to the Ian's question round about appeals process, many councils already have housing and/or social work review panels, and I wonder if any consideration has been given to making these bodies the appeal panel, if you like, to challenge any decision.
That's one of the options that we're looking at.
Convener, can I ask how much input COSLA has had in terms of this aspect of the proposals?
COSLA are very closely involved in developing the scheme as a whole. We have a development officer that's based in COSLA. There's a local authority practitioners group that meets once a month that's convened by COSLA, and these are the types of issues that we're discussing with them in partnership.
Annabelle, and then back to Ian.
Thanks. I just slightly moving subject a wee bit, because I had understood we were supposed to be looking at the long title of this order, which I won't repeat because the Minister did it so well at the outset. And I mean, reading the papers last night, I did understand the technical point that had been raised that you were coming to speak to today, but it did seem to me, by the same token, that on the basis that actually the Scottish Parliament doesn't have any competence with respect to the provision, section 69 of the 2000 Act, referred to in the order, the Child Support, Pensions and Social Security Act of 2000, section 69 thereof, and on the basis, taking into account also that the UK Government have indicated that they have no plans to amend this particular provision in the intervening period before the order will take effect. It did seem to me that whilst the question posed was a nice arcane question, if you were a sort of administrative legal expert, nonetheless, from a practical point of view, the issue really was arcane, and that certainly there would be no reason not to recommend that the order be approved by this committee and the Scottish Parliament. I wonder if you would agree with my comments. I hope. Assume you probably would.
I think we would agree with the comments, and we have had indication from the UK government that they have no intention of, currently no intention of changing Section 69, and that we think that, you know, what we are proposing should be accepted.
And sorry if I could just because it is an arcane issue, but I mean the starting off point in any event, irrespective of whether the UK government were going to amend or not going to amend, and in fact they've confirmed they're not, we don't have any power over it anyway. It's a reserved matter, so it actually, as a matter of practical effect, makes no difference to the legal effect of this order here in the Scottish Parliament.
Let the legal person answer that one.
I quite like arcade legal points, but I'll be brief. Yes, it has to be clear what this provision is referring to. The legislation that Westminster has created is changing over a period of time, so it has to be fixed at some point in that time. The order does that at 2 logical points. Subordinate Legislation Committee have quite properly pointed out there is a potential for that to change given it's a future test. DWP have confirmed what we all know, that they have no intention at present of changing it anyway, and frankly that deals with the issue.
Thank you.
Yes. It's really a supplementary to Kevin's question, which again was around second-tier appeals, and I'm delighted to know that COSLA have been consulted to ensure that the second-tier appeal procedure suits them. I'm rather more concerned to know that work's been done to ensure that the second-tier appeal procedure is fair to those who are appealing and in fact also protects their legal and human rights. So I'd be interested to know who's been consulted to make sure that that is delivered correctly.
All of that will be taken into account. I mean, I am also anxious to make sure that the individual who makes an application to this fund for either a community care grant or a crisis grant gets a decision that they understand, and if they're not happy with, if somewhere they can take that decision and get it either reviewed or looked at again. So I think we're all anxious to do that, but we have to look at the proportionate of that in terms of the existing arrangements. I don't think we'd be able to do it under the current kind of independent social fund review body and commissioners in terms of cost, because our view, clearly the money from the social fund we want to go out there to people in the communities and not spent in administering it. So we have to look at that, but also ensuring there is a fair course of having a decision looked at again, and I certainly am anxious to see that, and we're looking at that through not just COSLA. I think we're looking at other ways through the Ombudsman. There might be other suggestions come up in terms of the whole process, but I think all of us are anxious to see that there is another tier to look at any decision that's made, that if anybody is not happy with the decision or feels they've been treated unfairly, that is looked at.
I mean, nobody could disagree with that, but my question was, who's being consulted on that basis? We know COSLA, we know the Ombudsman, or is there anybody else?
I think the stakeholders have been consulted.
We have regular discussions about all the kind of like issues relating to the setting up of the new Scottish Welfare Fund through the Welfare Reform Scrutiny Group, which includes the Poverty Alliance, CAS, CPAG, SCBO. So we are engaging with the third sector on these issues.
Just ask Minister finally for some clarification on some of the points that you made earlier. The additional, I think, 1.8 million that's come, has that come from Westminster to the Scottish Government? Has that come from within the Scottish Government's budget?
It's come from the DWP. So it's come from the DWP for set-up costs for this first year.
Okay, so is that money intended to be spent by the Scottish Government, or will some of it be dispersed to local authorities for their set-up costs?
Yes, the intention is to send it to pass it on to local authorities. Sorry, Convener, you've been copied into this reply, so it's probably on its way to your inbox.
Yes.
One final question, and it's just something I've been trying to keep clarity in my own mind about in terms of the additional funds for the social fund, the £9 million. I think it's been stated that this would assist about 100,000 claimants, is that right? Or is it 100,000 claims? Because claimants can claim more than once in a year. And so is it a total number of claimants, or is it a total number of claims?
I think what has been said is it would allow a further 100,000 community care.
Grants.
Sorry, not crisis grants for the 100,000.
Yeah.
Crisis grants to be paid. So it could be 100,000 new ones, or it could be somebody who had a
Combination.
crisis more than once in a year. Yes.
That clarifies that. Thanks very much. I think we've exhausted our questions. So we now then have to go to there's been no indication from members who wish to debate the motion. So I think we invite the Minister to make any comments that she has before moving the motion.
I think I just invite the committee to approve the order. Move the motion.
The members agree to recommend to the Parliament the Scotland Act 1998 modification of Schedule 5, Number 2 Order 2012 draft should be approved. Okay, that's done. Thanks very much, Minister.
Thank you.
I'll suspend again to allow changeover. Okay, our next agenda item this morning, agenda item 4 on the Social Security Advisory Committee. We're going to take evidence now from Paul Gray and Professor Janet Walker, who are respectively Chair and Deputy Chair of the Social Security Advisory Committee. Welcome to you both to their proceedings this morning. There are two areas that I think would be useful to explore during this item. Firstly, the SSAC's work in relation to passported benefits, and secondly, the report on the UK Government's regulations around welfare reform, which was published yesterday. To start us off, therefore, I'd like to invite Mr Gray and Professor Walker to take 10 or 15 minutes to talk us through the work of the SSAC, the work they did on the passported benefits, and what they would highlight as the key issues of their finding in that work. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to join you and give evidence today. I don't think I need add any more by way of introduction. You've already introduced us, so thank you for that. A few words then first about the committee and its role generally. The committee was established back in 1980 in a bit of Westminster primary legislation, and it was established as an independent statutory body, so an arm's length body linked to the Department for Work and Pensions and receiving grant funding from the DWP for our role. A summary description of our role, I think, would be as the main UK advisory body, and I emphasise UK, on social security and related matters, for example, links with the labour market, employment, and so on. We're an independent body, as I say, and we seek to position ourselves as independent of government. of the department and of other sectional interests, but to seek independently to review relevant issues and evidence. And in terms of our role as laid down in the statute, essentially twofold. Firstly, to give advice and assistance to the UK Secretary of State, either at their invitation or at the committee's own initiative. And secondly, and the role that is most precisely embedded in legislation, our scrutiny of secondary legislation on social security that is brought to the Westminster Parliament. And it's a requirement of the 1980 Act that when the UK government is bringing forward social security legislation, that it is referred to the SSAC for scrutiny. And as a committee, we then have the right either to take it on what we would term a kind of informal basis, where we would take the material, review it with the department, and we may decide not to make any further formal inquiry about it, or alternatively, to take it, as we term it, as a statutory referral, in which case we would typically go out to consultation with an appropriate range of stakeholders, gather their input and views on the proposed secondary legislation, and then we would formally prepare a report on it, setting out the considered views of the committee in the light of the evidence we've reviewed and collected, and then that is formally presented to the Secretary of State, who in turn then considers our report and publishes the committee's report along with the government's own response to our observations when the regulations are formally tabled before the Westminster Parliament. In terms of recent activity, we are clearly going, as the committee knows, through a period of great change on welfare on a UK basis, and what we are observing is that the primary legislation, which in relation to working age benefits has always tended to set out broad high-level principles, but not the sort of detail regulation, that process is probably going a stage further, and the Westminster 2012 Welfare Reform Act probably took that move to kind of high-level principles a further stage, and most of the detail about the way in which the policy is going to operate is then included in the secondary legislation for which we have a formal scrutiny role. But I think I'd observe, in a sense, a further step in that process, and it certainly was true of the main universal credit regulations we reviewed in the summer, which I'll mention in a minute, that even the regulations themselves are not specifying in precise detail all the implementation, and there is an increasing reliance on the guidance which is prepared by the department for its staff, but also made publicly available, is becoming increasingly important in terms of understanding precisely how welfare is being administered. And as a committee, we are finding ourselves taking an increasing interest in saying that we wish to scrutinise that guidance as well as the formal regulations. So that's a sort of general scene setting on us and our role. In terms of the passported benefits work, just to say a few words about that, as you invited, convener. Back in the spring of 2011, we were invited by the DWP to undertake a study of passported benefits. particularly in the upcoming context of the introduction of universal credit. This was probably a rather kind of unusual remit for us. It kind of falls within the first of our formal roles I mentioned earlier of the ministers inviting us to study a particular area, but probably it was a much broader and bigger remit than typically the committee has received from government. And our terms of reference, which you've probably seen in the report we published, was to broadly identify ways in which benefits might be developed in future on the introduction of universal credit, including taking into account differences in accountability in different parts of the United Kingdom, and specifically in relation to the devolved accountability for passporting benefits in Scotland that rests with this Parliament. In terms of the background to our study, as I know the committee is well aware from all the evidence I've seen you've taken already from others, the background to passport benefits is very long-standing. Kind of over a century ago, the kind of initial origins of some forms of benefits in kind having an automatic or quasi-automatic link to core bits of the benefits system. But the overall structure of passported benefits has undoubtedly grown very considerably over that period, both, I think, in number and in complexity. So what our review identified, it was probably something around 25 independent passported benefits in England, I think around about 20 in Scotland and Wales, with really quite significant differences in the eligibility criteria. Also a lot of variety in terms of how they're administered, both by kind of UK departments, by devolved administrations, and quite increasingly a number of non-governmental organisations getting involved in this, for example, around the sort of energy and utility areas. And it was, I think, in the context of the lack of a overarching coherent strategy for passported benefits, the UK ministers were keen that we did undertake this review. In terms of some of our key findings, which let me quickly summarise, clear evidence from the major consultation we undertook with a whole range of stakeholders that passported benefits are seen to be very important in fulfilling needs and highly valued by those who receive them. The great burden of the evidence we received also suggested that benefits in kind for these sorts of services were viewed as particularly beneficial, and we sense no great appetite amongst stakeholder groups for cashing up of those benefits. A big area we looked at was considering whether or not passported benefits might constitute a disincentive to work in the context where passported benefits, as well as cash welfare benefits, potentially generate very high withdrawal rates as you go up through the income scale, as people take on work and take on more and more work. Our finding there that was really no strong evidence to suggest that passported benefits were a disincentive to work. But as much as anything, our sense was that there is quite often a lack of awareness for people who are moving into work or taking on more work, of understanding exactly what the consequence is going to be. Again, I think a feature of the fact that there isn't a simple overarching structure or strategy. So often people not absolutely clear as they would take a work decision what the overall impact would be. So although we saw no strong evidence that it was they're constituting a direct disincentive to work. What is very clear is that under the current patchwork, if I can use that word, there often are very significant cliff edges in the system, where once you put passported benefits on top of the direct welfare payments, you have very sharp cliff edges and certainly major reductions in the gains from taking on work or taking on more work. Amongst our other conclusions, we thought it was essential that as the UK government and devolved governments reviewed the arrangements for the medium and longer term, there would be huge benefits in looking for more simplicity and better coordination. For example, with a view to trying to reduce the multiple administrative costs that are involved in the current patchwork, and also to improve better targeting, because again, it's not clear when you put this patchwork together and see what's happening is actually the net result that's being produced a kind of conscious reflection of targeting decisions. We came up with no easy answers. I think it is a very complex area, and what we therefore sought to do in line with our terms of reference, rather than coming up with any kind of specific recommendations of this is what we would suggest the UK government does, what you should do in Scotland, we sought to highlight what seemed to us to be some key principles that the various administrations should take into account in future, particularly around the areas of simplification, and we came up with a number of thoughts on there, and also trying to improve the extent to which work pays as the overall system is put together. And obviously, I won't go on in these introductory remarks. We can say a bit more about that in response to questions. Shall I leave it there, or do you want me to say anything about universal credits at this stage?
If we give the opportunity for committee members to ask questions, we may get into that. Professor Walker, did you want to add anything at this point?
Thank you, Convener. No, I don't think so, except to say that perhaps it's important to know that we did talk quite extensively, to the two officials from Scotland, and I think my sense was in doing that there are some areas where it is less complicated for Scotland, particularly because of prescription being free across the board and so on, and because some of the schools were offering free school meals anyway to the younger children. So it seemed to us that you had already made quite a few steps to simplify some of these kind of complex benefits, and that there were opportunities really to look for further simplification within that.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll kick off by asking a sort of small question, I hope. You mentioned monitoring and evaluation. What sort of level is that at the moment, and how far do you think it has to progress in order to give you confidence that it will be robust enough as these changes start to come in terms of universal credit?
In terms of universal credit or the passported benefits?
Or the passported benefits, either.
I think in relation to passported benefits, it's a very variable picture. Clearly, the responsibility and accountabilities for the individual passported benefits rests in a whole lot of different places. And I won't say we looked at kind of in detail for each of those at the extent of monitoring and evaluation, but I think it wouldn't be unduly unfair or unkind to say that in many areas the system has been a bit like Topsy, and it's just grown. What I think is the big value of the necessity now for all the relevant administrations to look at these issues is that it provides the need and the opportunity to have a much clearer focus on what actually is it we're seeking to achieve with a particular passported benefit. Do we, how, if at all, do we want to target it? Professor Walker's already made the point that there are differences between Scotland and the rest of the, and certainly with England, in the extent of targeting or otherwise of some of the key benefits. What I think is clearly lacking, and I don't make this as a criticism of anybody in particular, but an observation, given that there has been no overarching strategy for the whole network of passported benefits, I don't think anybody, frankly, has seen it as their job or their role to take an overview of the system. And that, in a sense, is, I think, one of the key things we're saying as a committee. It's really rather important that rather than just having all these things happening rather randomly, the opportunity should be taken for the relevant authorities to take more of that overview.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Mr. Ray and Professor Walker, for their time today. It's very useful for us as a committee to have your evidence and the benefit of your experience. I've got before me some of your recommendations, I think, in respect of the overall changes to the system, introduction of universal credit. I have a couple of questions. The first relates to a recommendation made in terms of, I think you were urging caution in terms of IT development. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and what gives you, well, it doesn't explicitly say there is cause for concern, but I think underlying it there seems to be cause for concern. So what is it? What is the cause for concern?
I take it, Mr. Hepburn, you're now talking about universal credit.
Indeed,
specifically,
yes.
Rather than passported benefits. And I didn't say anything about that in my introduction, but if I could just say before I turn precisely to your question, we did undertake a major consultation report in the summer when we received from the DWP the then draft universal credit regulations and various related regulations on the benefit cap and so on. And as you said, Convener, that report was published yesterday by the DWP alongside the government's response. In terms of the IT issue, we are very conscious of as a committee that this is a very major set of changes that are being introduced. We are, of course, mindful that other major transformation projects in government have had their moment, shall we say, in relation to IT development and implementation. And so what I think we're really trying to say there is to encourage the DWP to be cautious, not to try and do too much too soon in terms of new IT development, and to take very much a phased approach. Indeed, I think that is the approach the department is seeking to take. I and one of our other members did actually, back earlier in the year, make a visit to the main IT development centre up in Warrington. Sorry, I should say down in Warrington, sitting where I'm sitting there. It was up in Warrington from where I set out, but down in Warrington. And I think it's fair to say we were generally encouraged by what we saw of a sort of careful and incremental approach that was being taken to IT implementation. It's not our role, frankly, as a committee to set ourselves up as IT experts. I think there are others kind of better placed to make those observations. But we were basically urging caution and care, and I think the whole phased approach of introduction to universal credit over a kind of 4 or 5 year period is broadly consistent with that aim.
So where did this come from then? I mean, you're saying it's obviously not your role to be IT experts, but were there IT experts providing you with evidence to make this recommendation?
In terms of our consultation, we didn't really get very much input from that sort of quarter. 1 or 2 of our members from their earlier business experience do have kind of significant knowledge and expertise in the development of IT systems, so that judgments from there were brought to bear. But I wouldn't want you to, frankly, put kind of too much weight on the degree of kind of particular expertise that we were bringing. The real point we were trying to get over is the importance of being cautious and deliberate about this, given our observation that we can all make that in major transformation projects, putting too much weight on too rapid IT development is sometimes a risk too far. Jen, do you want to add something?
Yes. Can I add to that? Because I think one of what we heard in our consultation endlessly are concerns about the digital by default, the whole sort of pressure on people using an IT system in order to make claims. And so I guess that was the aspect of the IT system that we looked at really specifically in terms of how user-friendly it would be, whether people would be able to manage it, what the barriers would be. And I mean, I've sensed from some of your discussions, and certainly we had it in our consultation, a lot of people saying that they're very concerned indeed about the ability of a number of the most vulnerable claimants to manage an IT system. So I think that when we were writing the report, a lot of what we were reflecting really are the concerns about the expectations early on that people would be able to manage this system.
That's the flip side of it, isn't it? The utilisation of IT by the service users and by those making the or processing claims and the like. But I mean, thank you for that. I think that's somewhat reassuring. I mean, when I saw that, I was immediately concerned there was some disaster about to unfold. That it doesn't seem that's the case. Can I ask one other question, Convener, in relation to another area that's to do with the housing element of universal credit, and you made a recommendation I think we would certainly endorse from the benefit of our experience calling on the UK Government to reflect further on the potential consequences on the under-occupancy proposals on a variety of categories of people. I just wonder if you could set out why you came to that position and what the response has been, if there has been one.
Well, there has indeed been a response. We looked very carefully at that particular issue, and obviously within the initial proposals that were tabled for us in draft form, there was a proposal that there should be a special arrangement or exemption from the under-occupancy rules in relation to people having need of live-in caring support. But we, having reviewed the evidence we collected, we did urge the government to give further consideration to whether there might be some other particular circumstances in which some modification might be made to the under-occupancy arrangements. And the particular groups we identified in our report were essentially three groups: the recently bereaved, disabled children and adults, and particularly around disabled children, the issue of there are several children in a household with one with kind of significant disabilities. Was that a consideration that should be given further thought in terms of number of bedrooms? And the third category was people kind of temporarily absent from a household, for example, kind of students temporarily absent. So we, in our recommendation, encouraged the government to give further thought, in particular, to those groups. The response the UK government came forward with in the report yesterday was that was one of very few of our recommendations that they have declined to accept. So they point out that in the original proposal and still in the proposals is the arrangement, special arrangements for living carers. But they concluded, despite our observations, that having considered it further, they don't intend to shift the position further.
You set out why?
Yes, I think you'll be able to see in the document they were not persuaded that those shifts should be made. They drew renewed attention to the range of kind of other options that are available to claimants to kind of mitigate the position in relation to under-occupancy.
It's on this same issue. One of the groups we in this category of people that we have particularly taken evidence on, perhaps being concerned about, might be single parents where there are shared childcare arrangements. Would they be included where you were thinking of family members were temporarily absent? Is that what you were? Would they fall into that category in your thinking?
No, I mean, I think that is another category that we had a lot of consultation responses about. And one of the things that we were asked to do when we did the consultation by the Minister for Welfare Reform was to look at where there were conflicting policies within universal credit, where the kind of policies here might conflict with policy elsewhere. And we did point out that, of course, all the policy within family law is very much about shared parenting. We're likely to have changes in England very soon, which put shared parenting as a presumption. And so, the expectation of children being able to live in two households is a very strong one within family law. It is here in Scotland, it is going to be in England. And we did put that forward as a group that we felt needed special consideration. But as the Chair has said, that wasn't a group that found much favour in response.
Sleep in the cupboard then? I'm not asking you to comment on that.
No. I think it's going to be a very interesting question in a number of family issues.
Okay, short supplementary for Annabelle on that.
Exactly on that point, and Jamie Hepburn, in fact, raised the issue I was going to raise, but just to tease that out a wee bit further, it's not simply, a kind of best outcome, that hoped for outcome of shared parenting. It's circumstances where, certainly here in Scotland, the sheriff would agree to, if you like, what's now called contact, but overnight access, but on the basis, particularly where you have young teenage girls, on the basis that the accommodation is suitable. So actually, if the government now is saying that from the definition of temporary absent, we have to exclude all this kind of family law, these family law scenarios, then that really is, causing or likely to cause, I would have thought, very significant problems in the area of family law on both sides of the border. Because what then is, in my example, the sheriff to do when there isn't a suitable place for the overnight teenage girl to stay? And whether the best interests of the child and the family in those circumstances.
I would only say I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's an area that I hope that will be looked at again in due course, because I think it is a point where there are really conflicting priorities around how we should be dealing with families, particularly ones who've separated.
It's on a different issue. If I lose my voice completely through this contribution, you and I can just wander off together. I was looking at the recommendations in relation to the self-employed, and it struck me that the self-employed have never been well served by our benefits system. And you do have a lot of clauses in here in relation to the recommendations with that. And I wondered if you could talk a wee bit about what you see as the issues coming up. And particular relevance to, I think, clause 10 and 12, it would seem to me that it's, again, there's a contradiction in public policy. It seems to be mitigating against the start-up of businesses, whereas in other fields of policy, people are encouraged to start up businesses.
I think the whole area of the self-employed emerged as, I won't say the biggest, but certainly one of the biggest sets of issues as we looked at all this in the summer. I think the first point I'd make is that, of course, what a big thing universal credit is doing in bringing together the whole range of legacy benefits into one place. Certainly on a UK basis, the majority of claimants are going to be in-work claimants. Now that has been a kind of familiar characteristic for HMRC in the past in operating the tax credit system, But in relation to DWP, the majority of claimants have obviously been kind of out of work or kind of seeking to move into work. So I think there's quite a big kind of cultural issue for the DWP in thinking about the consequence of an integrated universal credit, that actually they now need to give a lot more thought to the issues of those who are in work. That certainly raises lots of issues in relation, if you like, to the traditionally employed population. But you then layer on top of that the fact that we have a clear socio-economic trend, I think it's true in Scotland as well as in England, of an increasing amount of work being either kind of formally self-employed in traditional forms we've understood for some years, but also increasingly in, if you like, kind of more flexible kind of quasi-self-employed term basis, if I can use that term. So I think that was why the set of issues emerged as a big set of priorities. I think you'll have seen had a quick chance to see the sort of areas that we focused on in our report. The whole issue of monthly reporting, which it's kind of proposed as a key bit of the infrastructure of universal credit claims, we think will give rise to quite a lot of difficult issues. And we recommended that kind of further thought needed to be given to kind of single blanket system kind of work for everybody, and the government's kind of responded positively to that. Another area which I think you were perhaps touching on in your question was that in the original draft proposals as they came to us, the proposition was there should only be allowance for one startup in the self-employed business. And we took the view, drawing on the material we gathered from our consultation, that that was too rigorous and strict. And so another of our recommendations, which I'm pleased to say the government has indicated it's accepting, is that should be changed, and they're now proposing self-employed should be allowed, as it were, kind of one startup kind of every 5 years. There were also quite a lot of issues in the detail of our recommendations around the alignment of the reporting systems within universal credit as distinct from those in the tax system. And what we spotted initially was there seemed to be quite a lot of detailed differences on that, and so another of our recommendations was to press the government strongly to ensure that there is full alignment of those rules, so that people either kind of moving into self-employment or to kind of relatively immature stage in the development of their businesses, as well as all the handicaps they have to face, they're not having to navigate subtle and detailed differences of treatment between HMRC and universal credit. And again, that's a recommendation I'm pleased to say the government has accepted. But to go back to my general point, I think this is going to be an area, a general area, where there could well be quite significant teething problems, and there will be a need to keep under review, actually, is this working as effectively as it could for self-employed?
Yes, I'm going to raise some issues on self-employment myself. However, the issue that concerns me most is the one that you relate to in paragraph 7 of the paper we have in front of us, which relates to income flows that are irregular or highly seasonal. Now, coming from a rural area of Scotland, I'm aware that there are business models that exist in Scotland that create low-income, self-employed people who have extremely seasonal incomes. In fact, I know of some who perhaps get their entire income on a single day of the year. Do you believe that there is the flexibility needed? I see you recommend that the government look at this further. But is there enough evidence available in that area at the moment, or is there a need to expand that area significantly in terms of research?
I think it's an issue on which, as a committee, we would still have concerns, and the kind of proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We're encouraged that the government, in its response yesterday, has kind of acknowledged, as it were, the underlying point I think we were trying to make, that regular monthly income flows aren't the norm for all kinds of businesses, and there needs to be flexibility. I think it's going to be quite a big issue for frontline staff in administering exactly how to respond to businesses of that sort. It was literally only yesterday that the government also produced the first draft of the detailed guidance material, which I mentioned in my introductory remarks, which frankly we haven't had a chance to look at yet. I mean, I have it sitting here. It's a sort of document about that thick. I'm hoping that when we have a chance to scrutinise that guidance material, that will give the kind of further interpretive material to what it says on the face of the regulations, that will be reassured that those sort of issues are being addressed. But as we speak, I honestly don't know whether or not I think the department has responded satisfactorily to that yet. Jan, did you want to add something to that?
I'm just going to add that a few years ago the committee did produce some of its own research, particularly on seasonal workers, and how they were dealt with within, sort of in terms of job search activity when they weren't working, how their income was taken into account. And certainly in that research that we did, we found a very patchy picture around the country, and certainly some people in seasonal work doing really poorly when it came to having their affairs looked after in a way that made sense for them during the year. Whether there is further research from that, in answer to your question, I don't know. But I mean, when we've had a look at the guidance, it may well be that trying to understand the size of the problem could be quite helpful, because I suspect it's quite a big one, actually.
Fair to say that the level of awareness in government is rising on that issue. And would it also perhaps be fair to say that the level of concern is only a recent introduction to the NECs?
I think I would say I hope so. But if we reach the judgment that awareness is not risen as much as we think it's appropriate, we will look to make appropriate noises to further encourage the process.
You said in your introductory remarks, Mr. Gray, that this tranche of welfare reform legislation went further than any other that you could remember in terms of pushing discretion down to the guidance rather than either the primary or the secondary legislation. And I just wondered if you or the committee felt that this would potentially compromise the rights of those trying to access the system, given that they would have fewer rights in law as opposed to through the discretion of guidance, and secondly, whether you felt it was compromising your scrutiny of the system, since, as you said, you've got a formal scrutiny role when it comes to secondary legislation.
I think on the first point, potentially it could compromise those rights. I think as a committee we well understand why that process is happening, and I don't interpret it as any kind of indication of malign intent on the part of UK government. I think it's an almost inevitable consequence of a development of policy that is seeking to be linking the benefit system to much more proactive intervention in the labour market. And we're moving, if one went back many decades, one would see bits of the benefit system that operated kind of very mechanically without an attempt to have a dynamic impact on getting people into work. And what we've seen through a succession of Westminster governments from all the parties who've been in government over the last few decades is a consistent wish to push that process of generating a kind of more proactive impact on the labour market. So, you know, I think there is benign intent here, not malign, but nonetheless, in answer to your question, it could compromise rights, which is why we have been pushing very hard for saying, well, we need to follow the case. And if more is in guidance, then we think it's important for us to have a significant impact on that. On the second bit of your question, I'm actually very encouraged by the approach that DWP ministers have taken. They have already agreed this year, in a sense, significantly to expand the committee's role beyond what they would have been entitled to say the statute entitles us to. So there's a kind of arcane bit of history here called the 6-month rule, under which the primary statute says that any aspect of primary legislation on which regulations are brought forward within 6 months of the initial enactment, there is no statutory requirement to refer the regulations to us. So if you go back 30-odd years to when we set up, the thought was we should be scrutinising, as it were, regulations that came along to revise and amend previous initial sets of regulations. What has happened following the dialogue I've had with ministers at the beginning of this year is a ready agreement on their part that they would bring the main initial universal credit regulations to us on an equivalent basis as if they were statutorily required to refer them to us. So they did not legally have to bring the regulations to us, but I agreed with them we would operate the process on exactly the same basis as if it had been a statutory referral. So I take great encouragement from the fact government is recognising that, and the initial indications are that there is a similar willingness to engage us equally on a sort of non-statutory basis in scrutinising the guidance. But again, you know, we'll have to see how that goes, but so far so good.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. Maybe I could follow on from Ian's points there, round about the actual remit and role that your committee have. Obviously, one of the things which is exercising folk to a huge degree out there at this moment in time is assessment and decision making. What role have your committee had in advising government round about assessment and decision making in terms of benefit entitlement?
We have been regularly involved in this, and Jan may want to add to this in a minute. Clearly, most aspects of assessment and decision-making require a regulatory basis on which to proceed. So whenever regulations are required, or government is bringing forward amendment to regulations that bear on that process, they come to us for either formal scrutiny or, as I just described to my namesake, Mr. Gray, kind of an informal process. I mean, having had the benefit of sitting in the back row, listening to your earlier evidence gathering session on work capability assessments, just to kind of illustrate the point, certainly all the kind of regulations that underpinned that came to SSAC. As a committee, we have operated very much in parallel with and kept in close touch with Professor Malcolm Harrington in his independent reviewer role, which you were touching on in your earlier session. And certainly the sort of issues that you were flagging up in your earlier session are exactly the sort of things in which we take a close interest as and when regulations are brought to us, or it may be if we felt at any point there were kind of aspects of those arrangements within the benefit system that we felt would benefit from a further look or a further consultation process that we might initiate. It's exactly the sort of thing we might consider as an item for the kind of independent part of our work programme where, as it were, we generate an exercise ourselves rather than formally responding to an invitation from government. Jan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I can do. At the very beginning, when ESA was being introduced, we had a member of our committee actually working with a group of officials in DWP, looking at how the WCA would be put together, and she then came back to the committee and shared that with us, and we were able to feed in to a lot of that. When Professor Harrington took over and was doing the reviews, we worked alongside him, but clearly he was the person charged with doing the reviews. But one of the bits of work we did do, which I think had some influence, was thinking about how decisions were communicated to claimants. And there was an excellent pilot in Aberdeen, which you probably know, where they started piloting direct telephone conversation with claimants to talk about the decision-making process. That proved to be very successful, and as a result of that, Malcolm Harrington suggested it should be rolled out. We certainly also suggested from SAC that that was something that should become a routine part of the process, and it has become so. So it's that kind of involvement we've had over the last few years. But we are well aware from the most recent reviews there are still things to be sorted out.
As an Aberdeen MSP, I think many of my constituents would not term that pilot as being excellent, but I mean that's a matter of opinion. In terms of the committee's work roundabout assessment and decision making, have you made any particular recommendations to government round about the fact that the decision-making process is entirely separate from the assessment process in terms of the personnel involved?
Jan,
yes, we have indeed. That was certainly one of the things that came out of one of the early reports from Professor Harrington was the fact that decision makers tended to be rubber stamping the ATOS assessment and not necessarily taking a decision that was independent of their assessment. And so certainly at that time we also made representation to the department about the need to strengthen the role of decision makers and have them more independent. So yes, I mean it's something we have talked about, and we've been told that that's something that's being followed up.
In terms of our earlier discussions, we were talking about the ticking of boxes, whereby from our point of view that day, it may well have been on the box ticking exercise alone you would have possibly said that somebody was fit for work, but the additional information would have possibly swayed it into a situation where somebody would have been deemed not fit for work. In terms of what you're saying about rubber stamping, are you talking about folk who are taking a very brief overview and just saying, well, we're going with the flow in terms of the tick boxes, because there is no actual recommendation from the assessor?
But you look at the point system, and the thing that I think we were, certainly Professor Harrington was concerned about and SAC was concerned about 2 or 3 years ago, was the fact that the point system from the assessment tended to drive the decision, rather than looking at the meaning of some of the content of the assessment. And the recommendations we made that there should be, the decision maker should be looking at not just the numbers, but actually looking at the claimant in the round and their capability for work. And that they also should be seeking further information at this point before a decision was made if there wasn't sufficient information on which to base a thorough decision, if you like, so that fewer would go off to tribunal. So the whole idea really being that the decision maker is making a decision based on all of the evidence that they have in front of them.
One final question, Convener, and you probably heard in our evidence, in our discussion earlier, that we were discussing about the role of general practitioners in these processes. Do you have any comment or any findings that you've come up with round about that particular area?
But again, I think we've heard the same concerns that I was hearing you talk about this morning, about the position that I think is always taken is that the work capability assessment is that, and it's not a medical assessment. So I think there is a tension always within the WCA between it being about work capability, which is what ATOS is charged to do, and the fact that medical evidence contributes to that assessment. And I mean, we have no other information in SAC beyond what we've heard through the reviews and the information we have that certainly some GPs have been charging. That information has reached SAC. And that not always do GPs provide the evidence, if you like, the detailed evidence that might be helpful.
I think if I could just add one point on that. The position of GPs in relation to the benefit system, frankly, has been a long-standing and very difficult issue. I mean, GPs have for decades been, if you like, a key gateway to the benefit system through successive legislative frameworks, and the difficulty one faces there, as with any devolved or delegated system, where you're seeking to get kind of consistency of treatment and consistency of outcome, when you've got many thousands of individuals, all of whom are undertaking this particular gateway role in relation to the benefit system as almost as a kind of byproduct of their core day job. I mean, it is a very difficult issue to get consistent. The WCA has brought up particular issues of the sort you've observed and discussed, but I'd simply make the point in a sense the generic issue has not arisen because of the particular form of the WCA. It's a long-standing issue about the position of GPs as a key gateway to benefit entitlement.
One short supplementary finish off.
Yes, well, actually, it was bringing up a slightly different issue that had been alluded to earlier, Convener, on the issue of online applications and the flip side of the IT systems. And I note that you recommend that the UK government ensures that it has sufficient resources in place to support those claimants who are initially unable to make claims online because of capability or accessibility difficulties, to rather make claims by telephone or, where appropriate, through a home visit. And I just wonder, what's the response on that issue? Where do you think that's going to go? And when you make the reference to claimants who are initially unable to make claims online because of the various heads of problem, presumably if they have those difficulties at the outset, they probably will continue to have those difficulties going forward. So what does the word initially mean in that context?
I think it's another area where the jury is out. I mean, we made the recommendation to which you referred to government. There's been a positive response in general terms to that recommendation. It's certainly an area that we're going to keep kind of heavily focused on. I await with interest more detail from the government on exactly how they propose to provide kind of more targeted help and possibly financial assistance to third sector organisations to help and support in this process. On the word initially, I think our view in the committee is there will be significant numbers of people for whom use of digital technology is at the moment a foreign art. I don't think as a committee we have any objection to the government's desired direction of travel, that over a period it's going to be increasingly important for as many people as possible in different aspects of their life to be able to use digital access. And our thought around initially is to identify particular individuals and groups of individuals where appropriate kind of targeted initial support to get them over an initial barrier, so that maybe over time they will be able to do things more independently online is a perfectly sensible approach. If I can make one other kind of general point that I think is germane to your question. following all the work we did during the summer, one of the next bits of work we are going to undertake as a committee, and this is something which is sort of partly generated by our own wish to explore further, but I know that Lord Freud and other DWP ministers have been quite welcoming of this suggestion, is that we're going to do a particular study over the next 2 or 3 months of vulnerable claimants in relation to universal credit, and to try to get a bit deeper into the issue of, what are the kind of key characteristics of vulnerability, what needs to be done in more detail and more practically to ensure that those vulnerable individuals and vulnerable groups are not disadvantaged through the introduction of universal credit. So next spring we will be aiming to bring forward our thoughts on that issue, and I think I would expect they'd be very relevant to the kind of precise question that you're asking.
Can I thank you? That was very helpful and very interesting response. I'll just simply seek clarification, though, as to whether or not you anticipate in your further work in this area that you will end up at a position whereby the UK government will recognise that there will require to be a safety net for a number of individuals for a number of reasons, who perhaps for reason of physical capability, for reasons of financial capacity, for reasons of cultural preference, and for reasons of geographic access to computer online activities, may not at the outset be able to make an application online and may never be able to make an application online. Do you anticipate that the UK government will accept, in the end of the day, there should be some sort of safety net for such a group of people?
I would hope that is recognised. I mean, as to whether, on your point, will there be people never in a position to do that, I think time will tell on that. I would definitely anticipate the UK government being responsive to the proposition that certainly during the introductory period there will be particular characteristics and maybe kind of groups of characteristics shared by individuals which will point to the need for greater intervention and support to ensure that they can get access to universal credit. And that could, for example, include things being done online, but with more intervention and targeted support by departmental officials, possibly third sector agencies, in order to support them in that process. So I think there's a kind of difference between can people be expected to do it themselves independently online, and the extent to which it will be appropriate and practical to support online application for a larger proportion. I think I would accept. I think it's unlikely, certainly initially, that absolutely everybody will be able to do it online. But that's exactly the sort of issue we want to pursue further, and we will be pushing the UK government as we think appropriate to take the action that we identify.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much for your evidence this morning. It was very interesting, and I'm sure we'll keep monitoring as you move forward, because obviously there's a lot of work ahead of you. But thank Mr Gray and Professor Walker for your contribution this morning, and I'll suspend the meeting now for about 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I'll reopen the meeting by going to agenda item 5 on the Scottish Welfare Fund. And I welcome our next panel of witnesses who are here to provide views on the guidance for the Scottish Welfare Fund. I'd be grateful if each of the witnesses could introduce themselves and provide a brief outline of their views and any concerns about the guidance. That would be a useful start before we move on to questions from committee members. So I don't know if you've agreed in order how you're going to do this, but I'll leave it open to yourselves to make your opening contributions. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Richard Gass. I am the manager of Glasgow City Council's Welfare Rights and Money Advice Service. I'm here today in the capacity as the chair of Rights Advice Scotland, which is the umbrella organisation for all local authority welfare rights workers in Scotland. In relation to the guidance that we've seen so far, then it seems in many ways a slimmed down version of current DWP guidance, which extends over a far greater number of pages, which on one hand will give a greater degree of discretion at a local level. However, the ability to exercise that discretion locally will be in many ways restricted by the availability of the funds, and there are concerns over the size of money that's being made available. Aware of the fact that the Scottish Government has put additional resources in for year one to make up for the fact that the funds coming forward are less than the current level of spend. However, given the changes to welfare reform and that people will be with less money, you can't take large sums of money out of welfare without there being less money in folks' pockets. Just anticipate that there will be an increase in demand for this benefit, and given that part of the benefit will be crisis grants. In the past, when there were loans, that was somebody effectively borrowing their own money. On this occasion, where it's a crisis grant, that's money that does not have to be repaid, which will in many ways make it a more attractive proposition, and again we would expect to see an increase in applications from that. An issue also is that with universal credit on the horizon, that is going to be a monthly payment, and today we have folk claiming crisis loans because they've lost their money or whatever, and they get a crisis payment to tide them over until their next payment. Then going forward, these payments will need to be significantly larger because the period between the loss and the next payment date could be up to a month. The paper is still silent on the second tier review, and we'd be keen to see some independent appeal, not necessarily appeal, but independent review right, and not something that would be done in-house. Concern over the DWP alignment payments that will continue, that they appear to be available in situations where there is an entitlement to benefit. However, we foresee problems where someone perhaps is making a claim for benefit, but entitlement has not yet been established, and they could be directed to the Scottish Welfare Fund when indeed a payment was perhaps due from DWP. The paper is also silent on eligibility criteria. Once we have universal credit, the entitlements to clear from existing means-tested benefits, but for those who move on to universal credit towards the end of the year, will entitlement to universal credit be sufficient to allow an application to the Welfare Fund? Some other comments I've got really are not so much in relation to the guidance, so I'll maybe draw breath there. Thank you.
Hello, hi. My name's Nicole Bethune. I'm a senior welfare rights officer at Midlothian Council, and I've been doing welfare rights now for going on 20 years. I've had a look at the guidance, and along with Richard, I agree with what's been put. I think one of the issues when I was looking at the guidance was in regard to paragraph 4, which is about the funding, and it's clear from the options there that there could be a point where there is no money left within that month. And then when you look at what can qualify for what exclusions for a community care grant crisis loan is that you can't reapply for the same item within a 20-day period. And if someone wishes to ask for a first-tier review, the first review, the guidance suggests that the review would not proceed on the fact that the budget had been exhausted. So as someone on the ground that deals with people applying for grants and crisis loans, the problem could arise where someone is refused for a community care grant crisis grant because the budget is exhausted, and that they then apply before the 28 days for the same item and be refused again. So there'll be confusion there on whether that is something that can maybe be clarified in the guidance. Again, I think one of the issues as well that I noted was in the second tier review, and I think that under the present scheme we have the social fund inspectors. That is not going to be, but I think it is important that the second tier review is independent sort of scrutiny and is seen to be transparent, and is some of the options that are put forward for it being across local authority. I think the independence part of that and it being looked at independently is a good way forward, because it shows that that there is a grievance procedure and it provides an overview of how the scheme is working as well. So they were just my main points that I noted.
Hello there. My name's Tommy Gorman. I'm the Senior Project Manager for Macmillan Cancer Support, with responsible for Macmillan's benefit services throughout Scotland, which provide advice and support for people affected by cancer. And that includes the 5 main cancer treatment centres in Scotland: Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Inverness, where we have, in partnership with the Scottish Government, we have a significant advice resources there. And these services are to meet the needs of people affected by cancer who, through loss of income or increased expenditure as a direct result of a cancer diagnosis, either to a patient or in the family, experience a financial hardship. And it's quite appropriate that Macmillan spend or invest quite considerably in meeting crisis for people affected by cancer, and also in that attempting to prevent crisis for people affected by cancer. And we also work with other organisations like the local authorities, Citizens Advice and other advice-giving organisations to try to maximise the value of the investment that Macmillan make. And all of our work is completed in partnership. So perhaps my contribution to your session today is a bit different from my 2 frontline service colleagues. And I think the context of the discussion we're having in terms of meeting crisis for people affected by cancer, and if other long-term conditions like serious heart conditions, Alzheimer's, very often the impact of that condition has the same economic consequences as the impact of a cancer diagnosis. And we're just through the situation where we're actually starting to see the results of the changes from incapacity benefit to employment and support allowance, where the contributions-based element is only lasting for 12 months. So we're seeing reductions in household weekly income. We're also approaching next year the change from disability living allowance to the personal independence payment, which will see the policy prediction is that 500,000 people who are currently receiving disability living allowance will not receive the replacement benefit. Also, I think very worryingly, in April next year, the under-occupancy rules in housing, which is colloquially been called the bedroom tax, is being introduced. And we quite clearly see significant problems for low-income families, and especially for people with disabilities, not only cancer, but other disabilities as well, who, because they require an extra bedroom for a carer, they will have a 14% reduction in their housing benefit. So really, I think that's the context in which this discussion is taking place. And quite alarmingly, to some extent, Macmillan have been approached by some of our partners to find out what our position is on food banks. So it doesn't take too much expertise to know that the Scottish Welfare Fund will have much more pressure on it than the social fund that it replaces will have, and yet the amount of money will be roughly the same. In terms of what Macmillan and others have done to meet that, or continue to do to meet the crisis facing low-income cancer patients. In 2011, Macmillan, in a UK-wide basis, awarded £10.6 million, and we reached just under 32,000 cancer patients on low incomes, with a range of items provided. And in 2011, in Scotland, Macmillan paid out £1.8 million, and we assisted 4,652 low-income cancer patients in the process. Just for the information of this committee, and I think it's pretty relevant, the number of people that Macmillan assisted through their grant system in 2011 to cope with the fuel poverty was 2,825 low-income cancer patients, and we paid out £565,318 in that process, which was 33% of our grant expenditure in Scotland at that time. So as a charity who are investing really heavily to try to meet the crisis faced by people affected by cancer because of low income, we are really concerned that the new arrangements will not meet the need that we're going to face in 2013, 2014 and onwards. And therefore, as a charity, we've discussed that, I know this is an interim scheme, that there are contributions to be made to the policy for the scheme when the legislation is passed, and it's to move from interim to a fixed scheme. And we are concerned to find out or to make clear that the provision that's made by charities and other organisations isn't seen as a substitute for the state scheme. And other organisations like Chest Heart, it's not only Macmillan, Chest Heart and Stroke Scotland have a progressive grant scheme, as do Click Sargent, as do other organisations like St Vincent de Paul. So there is a need to have a discussion with all of these organisations to see how we can maximise the benefit that we can give out to individuals and families in crisis. And I think Macmillan have certainly made a contribution to that, and will continue to do so. But one of the big deficits in this whole situation that we're trying to face is the pressure on advice organisations like Richards and Nichols, and also the Macmillan organisations that we have throughout the country. So that's another element to the Scottish Welfare Fund, is the fact that we're dealing with so much bureaucracy to cope with the previous issues I mentioned, that it's going to be very difficult for us to get to as many people as we have done in the past. And I have, some contribution later on the types of items that we actually provide funding for, and how we could possibly work with the government and the charities to realise economies of scale, which can to some extent mitigate on the limitations on the budget that you're going to have moving from the Social Fund to the Scottish Welfare Fund. So these are just some initial thoughts.
Thanks very much to all of you for opening up the session with a lot of thought-provoking information. I'll open up to committee members. I'll go to Ian first.
Thanks, Convener, and I appreciate that. And in our earlier discussions on the Welfare Fund, I, for one, was quite concerned that we did take some evidence from those who were involved in actually working with the Social Fund, for which this is a replacement. And I think Richard said that the guidance largely tries to replicate the guidance that exists for the discretionary elements of the Social Fund at the moment. But all the panellists have made very clear that they think that the pressure on the Welfare Fund will be even greater than the pressure on the current Social Fund because of what's happening elsewhere in the benefits system. Can I ask then, in your experience, and I guess Nicole perhaps and Richard, of working with the Social Fund, how often do low and medium priority applications achieve success?
Not very often.
Right.
And I think that's realistic. And I think the Social Fund Inspector's Journal gives examples quite a lot, and it sort of outlines, where what they would look at in their transparency or at that second tier review is about lifting the priority where it's maybe locally been set at a lower priority, but about lifting it because of the circumstances. So I would say generally you don't very often get medium items. It's usually on high priority.
So it would be fair to say then that in the guidance that we're looking at, although it defines low, medium and high priority categories of applicants and items, the truth is that low and medium priority will almost never be available to anyone.
My experience would say that that is the case, yes.
So I could maybe just say that that's sometimes where the skill of a welfare rights worker could come in, where it might be perceived that an item is maybe of a lower priority, but when the other worker is able to bring evidence forward as to why that person has a particular need for the item, then it can perhaps be that the item's importance increases, but that is never achieved at initial application. That's only achieved at review or second tier review.
Nonetheless, even with that degree of skill from the welfare rights officer, if somebody does succeed in being considered a high priority and their application to be a high priority application, if the budget for that period, which the guidance suggests would be a month, has run out, then the local authority would be able to refuse simply on those grounds. And Nicole, you made reference to the capacity or lack of capacity to appeal against that decision. And in fact, I thought you were generous, because the guidance actually says review cannot be sought for the level of priority set for awards in that period. In effect, this means that a review cannot be requested where the application has been rejected solely on the basis that the budget has been exhausted. So the guidance as they stand don't just say that a review won't be successful on that basis. It says it cannot even be requested. Is that a reduction in people's current rights under the Social Fund? Do you think that that is a reasonable position for those who you represent when they're trying to apply to this fund?
Yeah, I do agree that by them, setting in the guidance saying that it's non-reviewable, the present under Social Fund, it would be looked at by the Social Fund inspectors, and even if where priority is looked, they can overturn at second tier. They can overturn and say, no, we are going to pay that, even though that budget might have.
So this is a reduction in the rights.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Fund.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And that also, of course, plays into the other issue around second-tier review, and the guidance is quite honest in saying that a second-tier review hasn't been decided on yet. And earlier today we heard some evidence from the Minister and her officials around the work to try and develop second-tier review, and the kind of options they said they were looking at were using existing local authority review procedures such as housing or social work panels within the same local authority but separate from the welfare fund decision making, or possibly some kind of peer review involving other councils. Now, I think it was yourself, Nicole, said that you believe there should be an independent second-tier review, and I just wonder if those kind of options would, in your view, actually constitute an independent review, and if not, what kind of thing would you have in mind?
I do think it's important that it is independent, and if you then have one of the proposals is within a local authority, a different, like you mentioned there, perhaps social work, whatever, that isn't sufficient, because you're wanting actually someone that is going to look at it objectively, and looking at the guidance, and one of the I think for in the future they're looking at the tribunal service, and I think it's down to someone that is going to look at it legalistically, looking at the guidance and being transparent and fair, and I think if you have it where there could be influence within the local authority, then that might not be seen as being that sort of transparency.
So I think it needs to be somebody who's outside the system altogether.
I think that,
this involvement.
Yeah, I think that would be, yes, I do. I actually think that even if it was that someone within the commissioners, the tribunal commissioners, if there was someone that could look at it, because they're used to looking at regulations, guidance, and I think it's true even the social fund inspectors have given comments sort of saying that there has to be that sort of scrutiny and it to be separate.
With your forbearance, Convener, one more. I've had loads of questions, but I restrict myself to one other area. In the discussions around the setting up of the welfare fund and the particular need for this kind of emergency or crisis support, given the other changes happening in the welfare system, there has been sometimes in those discussions the implication that this is a way which might be used to support people who've been sanctioned by DWP and therefore have no other source of income. But paragraph 6.9 in the guidance says that crisis grants and community care grants should not undermine DWP's sanctions and disallowances. So my question, I think, is if somebody has been sanctioned by DWP and is then left with no means of, for example, feeding their family, but have not suffered any other crisis or disaster, would your interpretation of this guidance mean that they would be turned away from the social welfare fund?
The reading of 6.9 does take you in that direction, and we have to remember that the person that's been sanctioned is one member of the family. If there's children in that household, they're effectively taking the penalty of that sanction, and I think 6.9 perhaps needs to have some leniency to allow for that.
Okay. Thanks.
Annabelle.
Thank you all for coming along. Just on that point, I mean, I had a number of queries just in relation to the evidence that has been taken thus far. I mean, it seems to me, reading 6.9, that the crisis grant can be granted to meet expenses in those circumstances which are the consequences of a disaster. So it would be up to the relevant official to make that decision. It wouldn't be per se foreclosed. Or am I missing something in the language here?
What we're requiring there is perhaps expansion of the guidance so that it's clear in local authorities that they are to take into consideration all the family circumstances. The paragraph at present is just a paragraph, I think, that it would benefit from some elaboration.
Right, although I would imagine that the general overarching principles apply to this decision making as would apply to every other decision making subject to the guidance. But your point has been made. I'm looking at paragraph 6.6, and that's links to other DWP benefits. And I just wonder, taking that a wee bit more broadly, what arrangements are currently being made with DWP counterparts to drive forward not just changes in the social fund, but indeed changes coming down the line to the whole welfare system currently reserved to the UK government in London? Is there a kind of proactive planning process currently underway? Because whilst that would not, I would imagine, solve all the problems, it would certainly help in some circumstances if there was a good planning in place and good engagement in place already to presumably mitigate some problems.
I think there's more work that can be done in this area. Locally, DWP are quite keen to ensure that on day one of the new Scottish Welfare Fund that they know where to direct people, because they anticipate folk coming through their doors and want to move them on to the appropriate places. However, in relation to most of the other changes, the DWP's position, as far as I can see, is a case of, well, these changes are happening and over to you, local authorities, for you to get the information out, and that they're not going to take that proactive role, but that's something that the local authorities will need to pick up. Having said that I know that there are meetings, and there is indeed one this afternoon in Glasgow, to look at some areas of joint work, so I don't want to be completely unfair to DWP, but certainly think they could be doing more.
Sorry, it was just my understanding that in some areas in Scotland there are kind of steering groups being set up which involve, many stakeholders, advice services out with councils, council welfare rights, DWP, but maybe I've got it wrong because you're looking at me blankly, so I don't know.
There's activity across all the local authority areas engaging with other sectors, but DWP's participation in those, to my knowledge, is minimal. Although what's happening today is maybe the start of that in the Glasgow area.
And obviously, from your perspective, the greater the involvement as we go forward of the DWP in the arrangements that you will be having to deal with, presumably the better as far as people like yourselves are concerned.
Yep, greater involvement from them, yes.
Thank you.
Kevin.
Thank you, Convener. And first of all, before I start questioning, can I actually commend the submission from Macmillan Cancer Support. I think it's extremely impressive that Macmillan are supporting folk at this moment in time without the welfare changes actually biting. And it is quite amazing how much money you're actually paying out to support people when many of us would have thought that the state itself should have picked up those bills. Unfortunately, we have these massive changes from the Westminster government, many of which we are aghast at. But today we're looking at the Scottish Welfare Fund. Obviously, a hit has been taken here as well, but more money has been put in by the Scottish Government to mitigate the disastrous consequences of the Westminster cuts. In terms of the Social Welfare Fund itself, and I want to concentrate, first of all, on that second-tier appeal system, because obviously we want a system which works, but we also want a system, I would say, which does not cost a lot of money, so that we can actually put that money into delivering these grants that are going to be so necessary as the other welfare cuts bite. I was interested in what Ms Bethune said round about existing housing and social work panels, because they deal with some extremely serious cases, and I would like to think that they were independent, objective, and legalistic, I think was the term that you used. Why do you think that these panels, these existing panels, could not take on the role of a final arbiter?
I think one of my concerns would be that local authorities throughout Scotland are of different sizes, and where you have Glasgow Council, which is a large a local authority that deals in processing large discretionary housing payments, Section 12 payments, Section 24 payments. You have smaller authorities that where that is done, and I just think that that sometimes influence is on the guidance and what the interpretation of the guidance, and that if you have someone that's independent, they will perhaps look at that differently. And I think what you have to look at as a guide for that is perhaps looking what has happened in the past at the Social Fund Commissioners, where they are independent and would still quite regularly overturn decisions, not all the time, and they would give out a clear decision as to why they would increase a priority or agree with the decision. So if it was that it went down the line of a local authority that when they are setting out their decisions, it was on that kind of basis. And I suppose it would only be in, as time went on, how that would be scrutinised and looked at.
Many appeals processes within local authorities are dealt with entirely within that local authority. Would you say that in those cases that they're not independent?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that they might be influenced by...
So if they're influenced, you're saying that they're not independent?
I think what I'm
You cannot be independent and be influenced. So you're either independent or you're not.
Well, then I would probably say they're not totally independent.
Okay, I'll move on from there. In terms of the current setup with the commissioners as exists, could you give us an indication of how much that setup actually costs?
I'm sorry, I couldn't give you that information.
Okay. Mr. Gass, do you want to come in on those points?
To draw the committee's attention to what was the Housing Benefit Review Board, which was an appeals mechanism dealt with by the local authority, and a number of years ago that function was transferred over to the Tribunal Service, and I can't give you the reasoning for that, but there must have been some reasoning as to why that change took place, and that might give some information to the committee as to the appropriate place to locate an appeal for this.
We may maybe have a look at that. In terms of the current cost of the commissioners, have you got any idea?
I couldn't give you that figure, but I'm sure the DWP would.
As practitioners, surely you would like to see the maximum amount of money going to the people that are actually in need, rather than the establishment of a big bureaucratic system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You would agree with that, Ms. Bethune. In which case, and obviously there has been no decision in this at all at this moment in time, if COSLA and some of the other stakeholders, for example, were to do some cross-cutting appeal system across local authorities, which would maybe involve members from a number of local authorities plus lay people to look at this, how would you feel about that?
I think that would probably achieve the required level of independence.
Ms. Bethune?
Yes, I would agree that would.
Thank you. Mr. Gorman, I know I've missed you out there, and I would be very interested to hear your take on what you think should be a realistic spend on the appeal system, because obviously the current situation is very, very costly indeed, and you know, from my perspective, I want to maximise the amount of money that we can give to those in most need.
The point I was going to make was that obviously any system with lay representation would be less costly than legal professionals, and maybe more informed about people's actual needs But what I was going to say was that in my current role with Macmillan and in my previous role with Western Bartonshire Council, I have significant experience of the Independent Review Service and have been in their offices in Birmingham on several occasions. And I think the problem that faces any adjudication system on the new Scottish Welfare Scheme is the reputation of the Independent Review Service. Even when an award or a claim was refused, people knew that it was refused on a proper basis. And the big issue for any new scheme and any decision-making process is to try to, at as low a cost as possible, to emulate the transparency that was there when we had the Independent Review Service with the independent commissioner and the independent social fund inspectors. And that doesn't have to be an over-expensive scheme if we look again at economies of scale and organisations working together.
Or maybe it can be joined up within an existing scheme which is already proven to be open and transparent. Because one of the difficulties, I would say, with a new organisation, with any new organisation, it takes a while to build up that level of trust. Would you agree?
Well, I would agree, but it will also take a period of time to build up case law and experience. So from day one, we should really be aiming at some decision-making process that people can understand, and that we don't need to have banks of lawyers within that process, that lay people can have a significant contribution to make to that. And we did have that experience in the social security system, where trade unions and employers' organisations had representatives on the panels, but they were removed for reasons best known to DWP and the people who made these decisions at the time. But there is that model there that is as transparent as we can have things for lay people to understand.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
The first thing I was wanting to, in fact, for the three of you, I guess, is the fact that we're looking at draft guidance here, and I'm presuming that the things that are being said here have been fed in through the various professional organisations and COSLA and individual local authorities back to the Minister and her department. Yes.
Points I've made here today aren't the first time they've been made.
Yeah, thank you very much. The second thing that I wanted to discuss, and I find really quite important here, is paragraph 1.4 in this draft in the annex, which talks about the fact that it's a discretionary scheme, the fact that it's a framework for the decision makers, which are those across local authorities, who should use discretion to ensure that underlying objectives of the fund are met. And then when you read further in the guidance, there's quite a lot there that does give discretion to each local authority. For example, if you look at the financial management aspects of it, there is the facility environment, there is the carry forwards, whether it's in deficit or wouldn't it be wonderful it was surplus, and the ability for augmentation, same as the Scottish Government has augmented the money that has been transferred over from Westminster. So I think my main question here is what practitioners are saying, if there's some typical responses here, that actually they would like some of that discretion removed and much tighter guidance put in place, or the ability of local authorities to work out the needs for their area and manage accordingly.
Difficulty, I guess, is it's the amount of money that will be available, because that's what will restrict discretion. And if you have discretion locally but insufficient funds, then there's a concern that locally you're seen to be excluding people because of your discretion when you've not been able to exercise discretion because of the level of funding.
What would you rather be able to say, terribly sorry, we don't have discretion, you're not getting the money, go away? Or would you rather be able to say, right, this is bedding in now, we have a fixed sum that's augmented by the Scottish Government, let's work out what's best for our area and how we move forward with this? And would you I mean, I'm also a bit confused about this thing about, you know, you can't go back with an application if you've refused somebody on the grounds of the budget being exhausted. Surely there's a discretion there that says you don't take the application forward, therefore you're not disadvantaging that person coming back in April if you happen to refuse them in March.
I think when you look at the guidance, that isn't clear, and I think that was...
perhaps that's in the interpretation then, because
and
I
think
the discretion overrides an awful lot that I'm seeing here.
Well, under, sorry, the number, exclusions for both crisis grants and community care grants, that's 614.
Yeah.
It says if a person has applied for a community care grant or crisis grant for the same item or services within the last 20 days for which an award has been made or refused, and there's not been a relevant change of circumstances. And then it goes on to say this means that one of the determining factors in making the previous decision has changed, for example, a change in the circumstance of the appellant. So what that is suggesting to me is that when you look at the review on 11.1, it mentions reviews cannot be sought for the level of priority set for awards in that period. And it makes reference to the financial management in section 4. In effect, this means that a review cannot be requested where the applicant has been rejected solely on the basis that the budget has been exhausted. And I think the point that I was trying to put forward was that you could have a situation there that someone could be assessed as a high priority for these items, but would be refused on the fact that the budget had been exhausted. And it's been suggested in 4, which is the options that you know, they could carry forward applications, and that there has to be a 28-day for someone to reapply. Now, I don't think that's clear to applicants when they're applying, that if they claimed again within within a 28-day period for the same item, saying, oh well, I didn't get it this month, I'll put in for it next month, but it hasn't been a full 28 days, they're going to come up to the same problem. I think that it's not clear in the guidance, that perhaps there needs to be clarity.
Yeah. I guess that's one of these things about interpretation, but perhaps if there is a confusion about that, it is something that should be put forward, and I'm sure it will be picked up from this meeting. But I suspect with so many of these things, a lot of it is in the reading and in the interpretation. And I think my main question is, do practitioners wish something absolutely rigid that cannot be moved from, or do they wish to have discretion within their own local authorities? It's a very basic question. And yes, I understand the thing about the money, Mr. Gass, but the fact is that there is a fixed budget there that is being augmented by the Scottish Government to the best of their ability in hard times. And, you know, so it's incumbent on all of us to try and manage this as best possible.
Unfortunately, I can't give you a straight answer to a very straight question. That's because it's an issue that is debated. Do you want a strict statutory entitlement where there's rights to be enforced versus a discretionary scheme where sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good? And within our community, our welfare rights community, that's an issue that we could discuss for several hours and still not come to an agreement on.
I guess that's true. But one quick question for Mr. Gorman, actually. I found something you said, Mr. Gorman, I thought was really interesting when you spoke about the great work that Macmillan does and that many other charities do across the country, again in augmentation of things that you know, a lot of us wish would be better provided by central government and local government. You talked about the ability for economies of scale. And certainly I've often found that, I'll be very honest, with a lot of charities there could be economies of scale, with a lot of voluntary organisations, and indeed with local government and national government there could be economies of scale. But on the very specific in relation to what you were saying, is that a discussion that's ongoing?
Certainly a discussion that's ongoing within Macmillan, because we are constantly speaking with the other charities, local government and partners. When I mentioned the issue of the food banks, which I think is quite worrying, it's part of that ongoing discussion. But in terms of economies of scale, I think that there are, I mentioned some of the organisations who are helping within the communities, including Macmillan, but not exclusively Macmillan, and not exclusively, you know, organisations that we would say are charities that we would speak about every day. But if you look at the types of items that the grants will be applied for to provide for in the community, you've got issues like and I speak mainly from a position of a long-term disability. Tumble dryers, cookers, washing machines, fridge freezers, beds, bedding and clothing. These are the big asks from the Macmillan grant system. Right. If we have a situation where that will be pretty typical of, as I mentioned, Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland, Click Sargent, St Vincent de Paul, surely we have the ability to get round the table and say, well, if we're all separately providing these items and services, there must be some way that we can get a better outcome for the investment collectively. So that was why I mentioned the economies of scale, because I think there are some practical applications that we can put in place that can make things better even within a difficult situation.
Thank you very much. Thank you all of you.
Yes, and I was also very interested in your comment earlier about economies of scale, and I'm very pleased that Linda Fabiani raised the issue with you, because I think it's a very, very important point that you make, and a very helpful and constructive point, taking into account the financial straits that we face. I wanted to go back to the issue of discretion, which I think is very important for a lot of reasons. I can understand if you put in the spot with a yes/no, it's sometimes difficult. But I can't really see a no to this on the part if you were coming from the perspective of a local authority. But in particular, I would say, because leaving to one side all other issues, I mean, I would have thought that certainly in the community care side of things, what we should be looking to do is to factor this into the preventative spend agenda, because we want to, over time, ameliorate and improve people's situations. And I would have thought, therefore, that would be important, that the local authority had the discretion, to the extent that it seems to have under the guidance, to focus on its approach, taking into account its preventative spend agenda. I don't know if you've got any comments on that.
If I've come across as being opposed to discretion, then that's not really where I want to be. Just commenting on the fact that it's maybe simplistic. If there's strict entitlement, you can turn to someone and go, you meet the rules, here, you're entitled. And if there's then insufficient funds, then blame can lie at the door of the fund holder. But if it's down to discretion and you've got to kind of temper entitlement with managing a pot, it can compromise that. And on some occasions, you could be saying yes to someone, and on other occasions, you're saying no to someone. And from a strict welfare rights perspective, that's kind of difficult. The point you make about being able to control your spend, then I'd have to agree.
Okay, thank you very much.
Question, just to get clarity from my own point of view. In terms of the money possibly running out at the end of a month, would a local authority normally, at normal circumstances, divide the money that they have equally across 12 months, or would they know that in certain periods there's going to be more pressure, during winter time and what have you? So do they have the discretion locally to say, we'll skew the money towards winter months and ease it off during summer months? Is that how it would normally operate?
I would hope that approach was taken, and in order to predict the amounts per month, we need some data, some evidence from the DWP, because they introduced a social fund which replaced a statutory grant system, and then they were given discretionary budget to manage over the months, and they've got years of experience as to when the peaks and troughs are, which particular items have a seasonal uptake, and that information will be very useful coming forward, but we haven't seen that information. However, there is a slight difference that they were not operating crisis grants. We'll be operating crisis grants as opposed to loans. So it might change to a degree, but there's probably some very helpful data lying within DWP records if we were able to get hold of that.
Yeah, so there's some educated guesswork involved in it all. One sort of a practical sort of consideration, would someone who's receiving an application, as soon as they have that application, is that automatically when the application starts, or can they sort of suggest to the applicant, it might be worth your while waiting off 2 or 3 days because we're at the end of the month, you might not get any money at this time, and if you don't get it this time, you've actually denied yourself the opportunity for the next 28 days. Would they have that discretion to say, look, can you hold off this application for a few days?
I think, well, Nicole's looking for something in the guidance text. I think there is maybe something there. The danger you have of, you maybe got 2 or 3 at the end of the first month, if you then use them, then in the second month, you've actually got less to do that month, so you end up with 4 or 5 at the end of that month, and so where does it end? So I think there's that question. But I think there's a discussion.
Mention in the options there's 3 options that are open to local authorities, and it mentions about holding, if the applications are exhausted, to hold them over to the following month. And then I suppose that is an issue again. But when you read the guidance, and that's where, on a practical matter, if it's not processed and it's held over, then that gets by that 28-day. But I think it's just whether that needs to just be firmed up in the guidance.
And again, I'm assuming that the representations have been made from organisations like yourself for clarity around this.
I hope so. It's something that actually on being invited here today that I hadn't really looked at in greater detail, but it's something that I'll put forward.
I think it would be useful if you are collectively or individually looking at these issues. If you wanted to, write to us with these issues, we could possibly take them forward and make sure that the government is aware of any concerns that are coming in terms of practical application of the guidance, where there needs to be some clarity or some enhancement, if you like, of what's in the framework at the present time. We'd be, I think, happy to raise any questions that might still be outstanding if you want to use us as a means of getting that information. And that obviously, Mr Gorman, that extends to yourself if there's any questions that you think we could put which would clarify matters from your point of view. But in terms of where you and other charities who support through grants is concerned, do you have to factor in these types of issues? When do you expect there to be a greater demand, and do you sort of try and judge that in relation to the crisis loan system at the moment and say, well, we expect that we're going to get more pressure at a given time, and we know we have to hold back waiting on some of these issues arising?
Well, we try to be as expansive as possible, and as I've indicated in the paper, the cancer incidence is increasing, so that there's obviously much more pressure on Macmillan's funding. But one of the issues that has been really notable in the last 4 to 5 years is the amount of the Macmillan grant expenditure that's awarded for energy costs, fuel poverty, to put it simply, and that's something that really concerns us. And I think it's in terms of community care grants, it's one of the issues that wouldn't be covered by community care grants. And the other areas that just for the panel's information, that there are other items and services that wouldn't be covered by the new Scottish Welfare Fund, that Macmillan actually make payments for. The exclusions in Annex C. I just had a look at them. Removal or storage charges if the person is being rehoused following a compulsory purchase order. If there was a low income cancer patient in that position, we would certainly consider a grant. Debts, debt interest, etc. Well, when I mentioned the fuel poverty situation, most of the grants made to deal with energy costs are to meet a high fuel bill that people just can't afford. Medical, surgical, optical issues at point 9 in Annex C. Well, Macmillan would provide funds for people, for example, to be able to buy wigs, which are quite expensive. Work-related expenses, we would, if somebody had a problem with a work-related expense, and that would assist them to overcome their low income because of their cancer situation, we would look at that. Holidays is something that Macmillan have helped, particularly elderly couples. If they require a break away, then we look at that very favourably. Travelling expenses as well. Very often people find it very difficult because they don't fit into the hospital travel scheme. Macmillan have significant expenditure on travelling expenses for cancer patients going to have chemotherapy and radiotherapy, for example, and expenses to meet the needs of people who have no recourse to public funds. Macmillan would look at that if there was, say, for example, somebody who had no legal status in the country, whether they were a refugee and they were a cancer sufferer, we would certainly have a look at that situation. And so these are all exclusions from, I nearly said your scheme, but the Scottish Welfare Fund that Macmillan would certainly look sympathetically if the person met the appropriate conditions in terms of savings and income. So we do look at the peaks and trends of when the pressure will be on our grant expenditure, and we have an expert team in London who deal with these issues on a daily basis, and very happy for any information that this committee require from that expert group to be made available.
As I said, we'd be more than happy to receive any information that you think would be useful to us, and if that leads to us raising points with the government just to get clarity, then we can do that. So feel free to contact us. I don't think there's any other questions we have for you. So thanks very much. It was an interesting contribution from you all this morning. And I'll suspend again for a couple of minutes just to allow the witnesses to change before we go to our last item. What's that?
You're still suspended, yeah?
Yes. Okay, our final item this morning, item 6, is the Subordinate Legislation Council Tax Reduction Regulations. At our last meeting, we heard from the Scottish Government and COSLA / Glasgow City Council in relation to the Council Tax Reduction Scheme, for which the regulations provide, and the timing of the regulations to enable local authorities to process the council tax information in early 2013 for the next financial year. Since our meeting, the Subordinate Legislation Committee has reported on the regulations, and today we have an opportunity to consider the issues noted by that committee. Additionally, the note provided for members also invites us to note a matter that was identified by the Scottish Committee of the Administrative Justice and Tribunals Council. Do any members have any comments on them?
Well, sorry, I'm going to be the committee's legal bore on these things, but we'll take that role willingly. I read it, and I first of all, the Subledge committee made certain points, which the Scottish Government seems to me have said, OK, we'll come back and correct. The Scottish Committee, however, have sort of flagged up something, but have not, by the same token, made a formal kind of process note or whatever it would be called, which would preclude us going ahead and approving if we wish to do that, or not noting any objection, whatever the right way of doing this is. And the only last point I would make, taking that into account, and also very much bearing in mind the comments in terms of the importance of this being on the statute book made by members of COSLA at our meeting on 13th November, referred to in paragraph 13 today of our briefing note, I think that we should take that very seriously indeed in terms of our responsibilities, and it is clear that this needs to be on the statute book, and the various points that have been raised I don't think are of sufficient order to preclude us proceeding in terms of the overriding interests of timescale being met.
Well, the question then just remains if we just want to note the regulations. Is that the committee's
Agreed?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that ends today's meeting, and indeed the committee's meetings for this year. This is the last, so we don't have another one before Christmas. We'll have early in Christmas and New Year, so officially wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Okay. And that